The book is a bit frightening at the end because the point I'm trying to make is a lot of people think the pandemic is over, but it's not over. And there's some research I quote in the book that showed that many generations after the Spanish flu, which was in around 1919, 1920, 3 or 4 generations after that, there was still a psychological impact that was measurable. So that's a pretty interesting and frightening idea that this is a pandemic that's going to have an emotional and psychological impact for generations to come.
Hello, I'm here with Dr. Raj Persaud, eminent renowned psychiatrist, known for a host of books, such as the Simply Irresistible and Staying Sane, and now author of this new heavyweight, very heavy, good bicep curling material, The Mental Vaccine for COVID-19. Master of several TED Talks, and a guy that pulls no punches, so I'm led to believe. So please take it easy on me. Hello.
Hi.
Hi. Thank you so much for, this is my first ever interview, and I want to, in the interest of full disclosure, I'm absolutely terrified, and I've shirked away from doing anything to the camera my whole life due to shyness, body dysmorphic disorder, and all that kind of fun stuff. But interestingly, I found something quite fun in your book, that there was a chapter on loneliness, actually. You had a story about a real-life Full Monty situation where at first, people are inherently worried and awkward and shy about shedding their clothes. But hopefully I won't be doing that unless things get really interesting today. But it inspired me to embrace my fear and my awkwardness, which will be evidently apparent. And it's a good point to start, about loneliness in the pandemic. Can you expand upon that for me?
Well, the book was written, first of all, it's entitled The Mental Vaccine for COVID-19 because I noticed that everyone was emphasizing during the pandemic the idea that vaccines were going to save us. And there was a lot of emphasis on a vaccine rollout, how much was being spent on vaccines, which nation was ahead of which nation in terms of the number of vaccines being delivered. So there was a natural psychological tendency to see the problem of the pandemic as being basically a problem to do with physical medicine and curing people or preventing them from catching the thing. But in fact, all the evidence is, although COVID-19 and coronavirus is a serious illness to be avoided at all costs, in fact, the biggest impact of the pandemic will be mental, on our mental health and our emotional health, for various reasons we may discuss later. But it struck me that no one was discussing a mental vaccine, and yet a mental vaccine is needed, in a sense, more than a physical vaccine. And what would a mental vaccine look like? And the problem is that a physical vaccine can be very specific to a specific virus, but a mental vaccine, and this is why I wrote the book, would have to attack all the different problems that the pandemic presents psychologically, one of which was loneliness, which was a big problem during the pandemic because of the lockdown, and people couldn't socialize. And I think that was underestimated by governments who proposed lockdowns in not seeing the big impact that social isolation was going to lead to. It led to, for example, a dramatic rise in domestic violence, and probably a lot of violence towards children as well, et cetera, et cetera. But let's go back to the key question about loneliness. And the other point I tried to make throughout the book, going back to your point about pulling no punches, I believe the answers to all these questions is usually very surprising and often quite challenging, and that most of the answers as presented by the media, the mainstream media, are not just completely wrong answers to these problems, like the answer to loneliness, but they're actually usually counterproductive. So let's start with an analysis of loneliness, which was a very common problem. People think loneliness, the solution is find ways to end loneliness by presenting people with socializing opportunities of some kind. In fact, really, loneliness is about something to do with you, which is always a very challenging problem or position to take, which is that there's something that you're doing that's leading to isolation. And people find that very challenging. They think, I'm isolated because the government imposed a lockdown. But if you look around the world, people came up with very innovative solutions to loneliness. Some people hung around in their front garden and just chatted to anyone that went by. So actually, loneliness is really about overcoming your own personal inhibitions to socializing. Loneliness is something you do to yourself. And that's a very challenging position that people will find perhaps irritating and provocative, but also is liberating because it means there are things you can do about it. And the deeper question is, why are you inhibited? Why are you isolating yourself? And usually that's to do with overcoming awkwardness. What's the first thing you say to people? Feeling that you're going to be judged negatively by other people, feeling you're some kind of loser, hence your need to overcome loneliness by engaging with people. When you look at lonely people and compare them with people who are not lonely, there are personality differences that explain it. And my argument in the book is you can learn some relatively simple techniques whereby you can overcome loneliness by changing your approach to social interaction.
Okay. Well, this enforced solitude, as it were, has challenged people to confront this head on. They either have the tools or don't have the tools. There's also the alternative side, which I just thought of, as where this lack of the ability to be alone, the lack of solitude because you're surrounded and you're in lockdown with your kids and your wife and whatnot. So there are these two opposing things where you don't have enough time for yourself, you have too much time for yourself.
Yes, and that's another very important point that came up. I mean, one of the things the pandemic did was it said that it led to a lot of divorces. Well, did the pandemic itself lead to a lot of divorces, or was it the case that those relationships were in trouble before, and the pandemic held a mirror up to us, a very uncomfortable mirror, because we weren't allowed to escape and pursue all the distractions we normally pursue that made us escape some central problems in our lives. The pandemic held up a mirror to our lives, and it was often very uncomfortable viewing. So a lot of divorces may have occurred that may not otherwise have occurred, but those relationships may have been problematic or fractured and came under increased pressure during the pandemic. So this is another very important point. The book is meant to be an antidote to another very famous book, which was a book that everyone said everyone was reading during the pandemic, which was The Plague by Albert Camus, a famous French existentialist philosopher. He wrote it in the 1940s, and the story in The Plague, it's a novel, but it's meant to be a bit deeper than just a novel. It's meant to be telling us something about the way that we lead our lives. In the novel, there's a North African town that is attacked by an infection that is transmitted through rats. Hence the title of the book is The Plague. So the novel is about how this town reacts to all the problems we had during the last year, like lockdowns and isolation and smuggling and scams and fraud and so on. One of the points that Camus is making is that actually the plague isn't the rats and the bug you get. It actually was there all along. In other words, people were bored all along, and the plague just highlights and brings to the fore problems that people already had. And my book is an attempt to make the point that actually the plague illuminates that plague, as in Albert Camus' book and the current pandemic. All it does is it shows you problems that were already inherent in your personality that you were having not to address because you were distracted by going night clubbing every Friday night. And now you're not allowed to go night clubbing every Friday night. And because you're all the things that distracted you from examining your life have been removed, you're exposed to examining your life and confronting your life, and often there's a very uncomfortable answer when you do that.
I really didn't want to read your book. It was maybe arrogance, maybe naivety on my part. I thought I've been plagued with mental health issues my whole life, and I thought, how could something as effectively minor for me, who has been in lockdown of sorts myself, have spent years in not going out of my house or whatever, and so on, how could that affect my mental health? How could anything affect my life. Looking back on the last year, I did get divorced. It happened during lockdown. It started during lockdown. My wife left me, which led to a resurgence of some very severe, dormant, borderline traits. I had to go back on the dreaded benzodiazepines. I had to leave my kids to come back to England from France in order to seek treatment, to go to mental hospital. So for me, yes, it did hold a mirror up to the problems in my relationship, and quite quickly everything devolved into madness, and it was a terrible year. This is quite an all-encompassing piece. It's relevant outside the hysteria of COVID. And you presented lots of age-old strategies that can be implemented in regular daily life. Was that the aim from the start, to make something that approached COVID as merely a condensed example of our deeper psychological vulnerabilities?
Well, you're making a very good point. I mean, you had a particular experience of the pandemic. Certain things happened to you, right? There was no one pandemic. Everyone had their own pandemic. And the point I'm trying to make in the book is that each person, as a reflection of their own personality, had to contend with an extraordinary set of circumstances that people had never had to contend with before. And because no one had to contend with it before, they had to work out for themselves their own solutions or their own reaction. And as a result, each person's reaction was particular to them and their personality. So it was a challenge to try and capture that. But I also thought there were some very useful psychological ideas that people needed, which were not being disseminated, to help people cope with their own personal torture or turmoil that was represented by the particular problems of the pandemic. Now, one particular problem of the pandemic was, and there were many, which is why the book has several different chapters focusing on different aspects, is that psychologically, what are we looking for when we're under stress or when we face danger of some kind? It could be social threat, like a bullying boss at work, or it could be a physical threat, like a virus that seems in the atmosphere and can produce a very dangerous illness. And we have to not socialize or not go out. And even if people have just been out to the shops and come back, you may catch it from them. So one of the points the book makes is that deep down, what we're all looking for is what's called a place of safety. That place of safety may be a psychological place, or it could be a physical place. So let us say you were on the deck of the Titanic, and the Titanic had become very dangerous because it hit an iceberg. You're looking for a place of safety, which is no longer the Titanic, but is to get into a lifeboat. So that is a metaphor for what's going on whenever people are in trouble. So sometimes that place of safety is crawling inside a bottle. In terms of an alcoholic, may be drinking heavily, and that represents their place of safety. We're all looking for a place of safety, a refuge. Now, when you've got an unseen threat like a virus that seems to be everywhere, even inside your own house, and whatever you do, how many times you wash your hands, there was a chapter on OCD, you're still exposed to threat. What can you do? What becomes a place of safety from an unseen airborne threat that can be all around you at any one moment in time? So solving that enigma of the place of safety is a very important point. And we all need to find one, and we all need to understand the difference between a healthy place of safety and an unhealthy one. So to take a personal example, we're not meant to use personal examples, but I play a lot of tennis, I play a lot of sports. There's a sense in which, for me, a tennis court is my place of safety. I'm not worried about the stresses in my life at the time I'm playing tennis. It's better that it's something physically active and perhaps quite good for you, like tennis, than crawling inside a bottle and drinking heavily. But we all need a place of safety. One of the most interesting questions I ask clients when they come to see me, and I often see, because I work in private practice in Harley Street, some highly successful individuals who work very hard and are top of their fields. I say to them, and one of my early questions, what do you do for fun? And it's very interesting. I get a very blank look back from a lot of people who are professional, very, very successful. They don't seem to do anything for fun, and they think actually they're going to be taken less seriously if they're having a lot of fun in their lives. But having productive, non-dangerous fun is actually a very important place of safety. And many times even people who are not in mental health trouble are heading for it because they haven't worked out that central question. What is a place of safety in our lives?
Brilliant chapter that I love in your book about how animals, they get anxious but don't worry.
Yeah, I want to talk a bit about that because it's a very important point.
Whilst as humans, between these, so animals, they get anxious in emergency situations, running away from lions or people trying to take photos of them, but between that they do not worry. While this is the big point about human beings, is that we tend to ruminate, we tend to get anxious, worry about the future. Are we doomed by our own evolutionary success, as it were? You know?
Yeah, well, that's a very good question. Let's talk a bit about that. Now, we're going to get into a lot of trouble with animal lovers and people who have pets, because the statement, animals feel anxiety or fear, just like humans do, but animals don't worry, causes a cascade of trouble. We're going to get a lot of negative comments from people who said, well, I think my pet dog or my pet does worry. So I don't want to get bogged down into a fight over that. I'm not an animal expert, but what I am saying is that the field of psychology and psychiatry and anthropology and behavioral science believes, so don't blame me, I'm just the messenger here, believes that one important distinction between animals and us, and it is very important understanding this point in terms of understanding what mental health looks like, is that animals, we share with animals because we share an evolutionary history which goes back millions of years. Animals and us, because we are animals, have a system built into us which is very well evolved and includes the glands like the adrenal medulla, which secretes adrenaline. So when a lion is bounding towards us across the prairie, as it did hundreds of thousands of years ago when we were cavemen wandering through the African prairie, the adrenaline would kick in, we feel fear, and that fear, a very strong emotion, has survival value, and it leads us to escape the feared object, which is the lion running towards us. So the example I use in the book, and it's a famous example that I've referenced in terms of the psychological research done on this, are the example of the antelope and the lion. So the antelope lives in fear of the lion, because the lion can burst out of the undergrowth at any moment and eat an antelope. And if you observe herds of antelope, they graze, they eat, they look up every now and again to check there are no lions, okay? But they are relatively relaxed while they're eating. Suddenly a lion arrives and starts running after the herd, and the herd bolts. So the antelope start running. The antelope is definitely in the grip of fear at that moment and is running away from the lion. Very often, and it's very interesting how actually the percentages seem to be loaded heavily in favor of the antelope when the lion's trying to chase one down, quite often the antelope escapes the lion. And once the antelope has checked there's no lion on the horizon anymore because they've outrun the lion, they stop and they eat. And they are relatively relaxed because they know they've escaped the threat. In other words, they're in their safe place. They have a definite sense of safety and they have a definite sense of danger. The problem for human beings, because we evolved this thing called a brain, which has higher cognitive aspects that antelopes don't have, is we can do a thing called worry. And what worry is, there is no lion on the horizon, but you're worried there might be. So it's as if there is a lion. In other words, worry means you carry danger and threat with you wherever you are. Your bullying boss may be in the office, but you're worrying about your bullying boss before you even get to the office. So the journey to the office or your weekends at home get transformed into dangerous places despite the fact your boss isn't at home with you, because worry allows you to negatively anticipate the future and believe there is threat. So I'm not going to go into the solution here, but there is a very important solution to the problem of worry as opposed to the problem of fear. Now, the other point I want to make, and it's a very important point that the book tries to make, is we need to start by labeling the phenomena in our heads. Have I got a fear or have I got a worry? And what is the difference between the two? And labeling phenomena is extremely important. Now, one sign as to whether you've actually got a good therapist or not, and my next book is about this question, about how to know, how to find a good therapist, is any therapist that launches into treating your problem without saying, let's label what's going on in your head, let's have a conversation where we are clear about what's going on, and we label and distinguish between things like anxiety and worry, etc., etc. Any therapist that just launches straight into the treatment, which a lot of therapists do, you need to leave quietly, because that's a terrible therapist. Any therapist that starts with, let's hear clearly what you understand to be going on inside your head, and let's label it. And also, any therapist that doesn't define what a worry is, because worry has a very specific technical definition that distinguishes it from fear and anxiety. Any therapist that's not familiar with any of that stuff, you need to get out the room, close the door quietly, and leave, and find a therapist who does start off with this very key point. Let's label what's going on inside our heads. Only after we've labeled it correctly, then we can start to handle it, because we all need to handle ourselves. And this is another deep point about evolution. Our minds are a problem, because our minds allow us to see Angelina Jolie walk into the room and think, ooh, I fancy Angelina Jolie. I desire her. Unfortunately, you haven't got the equipment, physical, mental, or financial, to get Angelina Jolie. You're just not hot enough. But your mind doesn't get to that bit. Your mind doesn't say, Angelina Jolie, not possible, switch off the desire bit. She's dead to me now, okay? Instead, what happens is, Angelina Jolie walks into the room, you think, wow, I think I've got a chance. You have got no chance. I'm not picking on Angelina Jolie, but just any specific example. Your mind creates desires, expectations, wants, and needs, which it writes checks. You can't bank. You can't pay out. And that is one of the central problems. So understanding the problem your mind represents to you is a very important part of management of your mind and therefore mental health.
Billy Bob Thornton got Angelina Jolie.
Yeah, but that's because he's Billy Bob Thornton.
Oh, right, yeah.
That's an important thing to understand.
I really don't have a chance with her, do I? I missed my opportunity.
Yeah, I think you got distracted the minute I mentioned Angelina Jolie, and I lost you there. And I lost you at that point. You see the point I'm making? You see the way our brains work?
No, Yeah.
So what you need to do when you see Angelina Jolie is think to yourself, am I anything like Billy Bob Thornton, in terms of like a Hollywood A-list megastar? No, I'm not. We have difficulty accepting that.
You are, and I've watched someone who really challenges the status quo, who really seems to go against the kind of normal psychological interventions that occur. You push boundaries, you risk upsetting people, which perhaps you enjoy, but perhaps that's necessary. Do you think that's the way forward, rather than indulging in our pathologies, in our diagnoses given to us?
Well, you're right. My position is viewed by other people as very challenging and provocative and somewhat irritating, I have no doubt. But I do have very strong views that, and I'm going to say something very irritating, the vast majority of psychiatry, psychology, therapy, the therapy industry, for want of a better word, is barking up the wrong tree. And it is not just getting it wrong, it's actually damaging people and is dangerous. So let's take one example. People are often in the need of downloading and ventilating, and they need tea and sympathy, for want of a better word. And to some extent, therapy can do that. But therapy can never be just that. Therapy cannot just be kindness and acceptance of you. If you are really going to grow as an individual and become more resilient and deal with the brutal and cruel world that it is out there, then you do need to be challenged, because we grow through challenge. So let's take a physical fitness analogy. How do you become physically fit? Do people come around and just talk to you nicely and then you become physically fitter? No, you've got to get up at 5:30 in the morning and go for a run. And why is running or lifting weights in the gym, why does that make you more physically fit? And why? That's because you put your body under strain. You test your body. Every time you lift a weight that your muscles were never used to, your muscles grow. If you only ever lift weights your muscles are very used to and can lift very easily, your muscles do not grow. So if you take the physical fitness analogy, if you want to become physically fitter, you are going to be challenging your body, putting your body under strain in a graded manner, okay, and then in a graded manner, day after day, your body grows and responds to the strain by becoming fitter, the same applies to mental fitness or mental health. And that means any good therapist worth their salt, while they are kind and supportive, also challenges you to see what you are doing to yourself that's not so good, and the illusions you have about yourself, and the things you are avoiding doing that you really need to do. At the heart of all psychiatric, psychological, and emotional disorder is usually something you need to confront, something you need to do that you're refusing to do for various reasons. And what you're looking for is a different answer. You're looking for the answer which is easy. So one of my favorite analogies is we were the last two people on the deck of the Titanic. It hit an iceberg, the boat's going down, water is sloshing around our ankles. I look over the side of the boat and I say, I see a cold, icy jump into the North Atlantic Sea. It's a horrible jump, but I see people make the jump, they survive it, they swim to a lifeboat, they live. So we got two options. We stay on board the boat, it's going down, we will die, but there is an orchestra playing, and there seem to be some nice deck chairs, we'll be comfortable, or we get off the boat, it'll be a horrible jump, but we will live. Life is about that dilemma. And a lot of therapy says, stay on board the boat. We're going to be nice and warm and cuddly.
So why, if there's no positive outcome, why do they do that? Just for the short term?
Because the patient says, I look over the side of the boat, it's a cold, icy jump, I don't want to do the jump. And the patient says, help me feel like doing the jump. And when I feel better, then I'll do the jump. And I'm afraid to tell you something. The boat's going down, the water's around our ankles. We haven't got time to help you feel like doing the jump, point number one. Point number two, the fact you don't feel like doing the jump, despite the fact the boat is clearly going down and you face death, means there's very little that I can do that will help you feel like doing the jump. I'm afraid, and here's an answer that no one wants to hear, but it's the brutal truth. You need to do the jump, and then you'll feel like doing the jump. A lot of time in life, you've got to do something you don't want to do, and then afterwards, you'll feel like doing it. You've got to get up at 5:30 in the morning to go running. You don't feel like doing it the first time, the second time, the third time. It's like root canal treatment. But by the 10th time, you start feeling like doing it. Here's the key question. What is the secret to human transformation? What is the secret that helps us change and become better people? That's the million-dollar question. And I think most of therapy is supplying the wrong answer. Most of therapy is saying, have a conversation with a nice, warm, cuddly person, and that will transform you. Sometimes that works. Very rarely does it work, actually.
This probably ties in with your forthcoming book about NHS treatment. I can only imagine that I've been through it all, about how inadequate it is. Is it really just about keeping people, I don't know why ice seems the Titanic, on ice, just keep them okay, because it's too much stress for them, to the therapists, to involve themselves in the consequences that may or may not come up? And this brings me to another point. Is this very proactive approach, does it have drawbacks with people who are psychologically oppressed in very severe ways? Yeah.
Okay, well, again, very, very good questions. But the first thing I want to say is the NHS and private therapy as well, what's really going on is people are being processed, okay? Is anything real happening in terms of real change occurring? I'm not convinced that's really happening. There's a lot of warm bodies in a building doing stuff. They're seeing patients, conversations are occurring, appointments are made, come back next week, we'll talk again, blah, blah, blah. My question is, if you try to lift the veil behind that bureaucracy, is anyone actually getting better? What is meaningful that's occurring in terms of personal change? That's the million-dollar question. The other point I have to make is hundreds of thousands of years before the whole therapy industry occurred, how on earth did people cope? How on earth do people cope in parts of the world where there are no therapists? My point is life can be therapy. But for life to be therapy, you have to know how to make that work. You don't necessarily need to go and see a therapist to make that work. And my book says you can teach it to yourself. how to make life therapy. And one of the things you need to do is challenge your own therapist quite often, which is, again, I'm amazed how passive people are. One first question you should ask is, what qualifies you to be a therapist? And people can have qualifications, I don't mind that, but what I want to hear, to some extent, and I don't think patients challenge therapists enough, is why do you do this difficult work? It is very difficult work. What is your motivation? That's the million-dollar question as well. Why do we do what we do? And very rarely do therapists ever get asked that question.
Well,
and patients should ask that question.
But patients are there because they're psychologically vulnerable, in
Yes.
deep need of
Yes.
help, and
Yeah,
they
you're right.
they
Yes.
can't.
Yeah.
We're getting onto this a different.
Yeah, but I'll go back to your point about when people are deeply unwell. I agree that challenging them, you're right. There's a lot of nuance and there's a lot of sophistication and subtlety in therapy. And you have to sense if a patient can really cope with the we need to jump off the Titanic approach. And some people can't. I accept that point. And they need to be nurtured and there needs to be tea and sympathy and kindness and support as opposed to challenge.